Good afternoon, YouTube. This video is being made in a response to this CBC article. Vassy is interviewing the former Canadian ambassador to China, and this gentleman is trying to reach the public in a way by exposing the kind of, let's call it, the predisposition of the Canadian government to be biased and favorable to China, despite their obvious murderous intent towards humanity and the manipulation that they've done with the WHO. When I study some of the articles that I've been getting out of various sources from the web, and I'm sure many of you have done the same. If not, maybe you have done a little research. What I find is China in every way is trying to conceal the amount of dead, trying to conceal their involvement in the spread of the coronavirus in COVID, trying to conceal the fact that they prevented the Americans and other scientists to come in to study COVID in the early months, trying to conceal that they got information from Taiwan about the spread from human to human transmission, and it's extremely contagious. And because they don't recognize Taiwan, that they did not act on that information. I'm talking about the WHO now. And what I'm seeing more and more gives proof to my hypothesis that China is starting another great war. It's China versus everybody else, especially the United States. And what I find really just the absolute tell to their ruthlessness as the Chinese Communist Party in their behavior is that they're willing to let hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of their own people die in order to achieve that goal. Because how else are you going to release a super virus weapon upon humanity without first destroying your own people? And I don't care what anybody says. The research that I've done proves that they keep on destroying bodies. And you'll never know, the public will never know unless they send investigators from all over the world that can remain impartial and go over there and actually look. But by the time they arrive, China will have already cleaned up all trace of the mess. I'm saying their so-called hospitals are mass graves in disguise, that they're using those big furnaces to burn bodies like mad, that there is credibility to the idea that 21 million people could have disappeared in China. There's credibility to the fact that China's tactics with Trump radically changed after they saw that they were losing their economic warfare on the United States through manipulation and through willful blindness from the Americans. After Trump, the game changed because then they had leadership, and China didn't like that. So they probably paid by hook or by crook to try to destroy Trump and get him off the presidency as quick as possible. And it proved a lot of things, like the media is in the pocket of the Chinese, especially well, I want to say most major American news, the really obviously biased ones. So here in Canada, we have the problem of Chinese romanticism in the federal government. Trudeau wants to worship Xi Jinping in every way possible. And you know, if you look at their relationship together, President Xi couldn't care less for Trudeau. In fact, when I've seen them like publicly together, President Xi always ignores Trudeau. That's not the point. The point is Canada has weak leadership, and that they're willfully blind, as the Americans used to be, when it comes to China. And I really hope that at the end of this crisis, the silver lining to be found is that every nation reevaluates its relationship with China, if there's going to be a relationship to recover at the end of this. The Spaniards, the Italians, even the Dutch, people who have had the unfortunate experience of dealing with China in terms of, say, the medical equipment, for example, medical testing kits from China that have failed, completely failed. I think they're only about 30% accurate, 70% failure rate. 600,000 masks sent to the Netherlands that were found to be completely useless. The Dutch had to send them back or discard them. Manufactured by the Chinese, but they're absolutely useless. They're not safe. According to the Dutch had them, I guess, tested a bunch of them and found that they were completely unsafe. So they had to reject. My thinking is, if Canada doesn't wisen up, we're going to have a lot of deaths on our hands, because the fact that Trudeau is a globalist and doesn't believe in borders, the fact that he's allowed Roxham to stay open, and that there are flights coming in from Hong Kong, from Shanghai right now as we speak. I don't care what the press says. The borders are down. The borders don't exist in Canada underneath Trudeau. And it's really, really troubling, and it's extremely dangerous in this time. And it's even more, it will cost Canadian lives, and it will increase Canadian infections. I don't even believe it when the press says that we have somewhat of a handle on this, because as we all know, in Italy, there have been massive jumps at random in the infection and in the dead. And the same thing can happen here in Canada, because we're not only are we reluctant to quarantine, but we're very trusting. And like, I don't want to put down Canadians, but I mean, I see every day when I go out that there are people that are just walking and behaving like normal despite this crisis, and they don't treat COVID-19 with the proper respect that it deserves. They're not afraid. And some of you might argue we shouldn't be afraid. I would argue, if you don't want the virus to spread this badly, then don't take the risk unless you have to. But at the same token, our failure is not the people, but the leadership. Always the leadership. Trudeau just completely bungled it. You can look at what Theresa Tam does. Theresa Tam is actually, when I saw this article, right at the beginning, Vashi pretty much said that she was like her speeches were pretty much in line with what China told the WHO to do. So I can already tell from that small tell that Theresa Tam already is essentially in the pocket, or rather Trudeau is in the pocket of China. So it's... Here in Canada, we have a major problem with Chinese pro-propaganda that is just staggering to me. So I want to show you a few minutes of this clip because I had to get that rant off my chest. I was thinking about this interview, and it's really important, because Canadians don't feel like they're under attack, but we are. We are very much under attack by China right now. The influence keeps growing, and Trudeau is responsible. But I mean, the fact that Canadian people don't stand up and do something about that, that's also a big problem. So you can continue to turn and look the other way as long as you like, and pretend that the problem doesn't exist, but it's growing. And so I want to show you the clip here from this Canadian ambassador that really shed a lot of light on it. Thank you for watching.
The lessons of the experience of the last 3 months should be?
Well, I think there are lessons on two levels. So one is at the level of healthcare. We should have learned this lesson after SARS. And as I was saying, at least some of the mechanism was in place in China, but it wasn't it wasn't allowed to operate fully and as accurately as it should. So we have a problem there. I don't necessarily believe that simply suspending funding for the WHO is going to do the trick. I think we need to hold the WHO and China accountable. Yeah. We need the World Health Organization because we live in a globalized society where people leave Wuhan one day and they're in Vancouver or Toronto the next. We're globalized and we need some kind of reliable health system, and we clearly don't have that quite right. But the larger problem for Canada is not just a health problem or even a China problem, it's a global problem because China is much more influential in global bodies like the WHO, like the UN, bodies that we really depend on as a middle power and that we help to create. And as those are skewed by China's influence and in some respects corrupted, we've seen some of this, for example, when the UN tries to look at things like human rights or rule of law, and it does so in partnership with China. You know what the result is going to be.
Yeah, exactly. So they'll look the
other way. We're going into a world where the United States is acting much more unilaterally, but where the multilateral world that we used to depend on is also a lot less reliable. And we've got to do hard thinking that I don't see us doing right now.
What does that line of accountability look like? If rather than totally withhold funding, let's say that the objective is to hold the WHO, to hold China to account, what does that look like?
Well, one approach might be to say that the United States and its allies, Canada included, but a broad coalition of countries, are going to impose and maintain travel restrictions on countries that have proved unreliable when it comes to providing statistics. And only after they have shown their reliability and only after they've dealt with some of the problems that impede the accurate reporting of health problems will we open that. China is susceptible to pressure like that. China is also susceptible to broadly based criticism from a coalition of countries, not just the United States, because as we've seen, they've turned that into a Sino-American kind of squabble. But because our own system is breaking down, the United States is more unilateral, everyone's tending to go it alone, we're not capable of mounting that response. And it's absolutely essential for a crisis like this.
Before I let you go, Mr. Mulroney, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who remain in detention in China. My understanding through the reporting of the Globe and Mail is that because of the situation in jails where COVID-19 is concerned, they haven't been able to access any visits. Nobody has been able to access them. What is the latest information that you have on their cases?
Well, I'm going on the basis of the same information, and you know this is remarkably cruel on the part of China. Not only do we have to deal with the fact that their detention is so spurious and so unlawful, but they're unwilling to sit down with us and do just the practical thinking it would take to give us a level of reassurance that these two guys are okay. So this is, again, China turning the screws on us. And it's a reminder of how unsatisfactory the current state of affairs is. One of the problems, though, Vashi, I worry about is, again and again, our own officials use language that tends to flatter China, that tends to veer towards euphemism rather than facts. You can't get a country right if you don't even have the basic vocabulary for describing it. And until we have the courage and the clarity of thought to do that, we're going to be floundering as we are now.
To play devil's advocate for a second, Mr. Mulroney, when asked or when pressed about that, the federal government often talks about navigating the difficult relationship and I guess sort of explaining the posture that they've taken insofar as their intent is to secure what's best for Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor and the relationship between the two countries. What would your response be to that?
My response to that would be there's a tendency to confuse diplomacy with flattery. You can stick to the facts, and you can do that without insulting China, but you don't have to say things that are beyond what you know to be true. And you don't need to flatter China. Time and again, if we just stuck to the facts and didn't say that, for example, China's response has been commendable, or we didn't say things about China's approach to human rights or the other problems they face, we simply describe the situation as it is, we'd be in a much better place. But our tendency, the government's tendency to do this, the only people it fools is Canadians. And they've got to find the courage just to stick to the facts, not flattery, but facts.
Okay, I'll leave it there, Mr.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It is flattery. and it's outright lying, because the fact of the matter is China comes to Canada with very, very evil and manipulative intent. And the government is neither willing to point that out. They're actually trying to say the opposite, so they're part of the trap that's being set as well. And they're just as worthy of blame as those people are for giving them the inroads to destroy this country. And I'm looking at it, even if you look at the 5G Huawei network that China intends to bring here, why on earth would you trust the Chinese for that kind of infrastructure? And they're trying to praise them at every turn. This propaganda from China. I wonder how long it's going to hold water after this crisis is done. It gives me great anger that this kind of situation, that the Canadians, the government is so stupid, deliberately and willfully blind to the peril that they put the country in when they embrace somebody and trust somebody like China. It cannot be done. And don't you dare blame it on racism or try to accuse the Canadian people of being racist for trying to protect themselves, because it's not racism if you don't have borders protecting the house, then robbers can come in and destroy everything, so to speak, right? So you got to establish security in your own nation before you can engage in that kind of crazy romanticism. And the problem is so deep, but it essentially stems from leadership. And that's the whole joke. We just don't have people in leadership that are remotely worthy or educated enough or even patriotic enough, because I'll use that term. That's the right term. That love Canada enough to protect it, and love its own citizens enough to protect them. There's some kind of evil motivation, maybe money at the back, that's clouding their common sense and influencing their decision. And I love how this gentleman put it out nicely, that you don't have to flatter China. I mean, why would we flatter China for anything? Why not? Why it seems to be a taboo subject to put them down in their place. So, and the problem is much deeper than just, China doing a little bit. That's the problem, that shadow where we can say, oh, China didn't act with malevolent intent, or they didn't mean it, or they made a mistake. No. If you don't think that everything leading up to the events of coronavirus and the coronavirus itself wasn't a planned act by those things, you haven't been paying attention. China did plan this far in advance. I would say H1N1 and SARS was probably their opening salvo, experimenting how that worked. And believe me, they're not finished. If the situation gets bad enough, they'll escalate it again, and they'll release another one. And if we're not careful and we don't get the situation with these people under control, I mean, I don't expect Canada to. I expect Canada to be lazy and do nothing, as the leader is typically doing. But I do expect that the Americans will make them answer for this in time. So my prediction is, as soon as this gets under control, that the Americans may find reason to find blame. And the WHO and China is responsible. Because of course the WHO is their speaker of influence, let's say. They just do what they're told. And to me, it's extremely dangerous, that kind of power in the wrong hands. Thank you for watching.